Hey guys, so today I wanted to make a video about a little bit of a smaller part of nuxtJS because I've noticed when I've moved over from Vuex to nuxtJS, which Vuex is built into nuxtJS, but Nuxt is a server-side rendered version of Vuex built by Alexander Chopin, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm sorry if I'm wrong. But so what I've noticed is when I moved over from Vue to Nuxt, the one thing that confused me quite a bit was the difference between data, async data, fetch, and nuxtServerInit. And I don't mean fetch as in the web API fetch. I mean the method fetch on the Nuxt object. So today I'm gonna go through this a little bit and what I understand from it. In case you got stuck understanding this, this is how I made sense of it. First of all, let's just recap what Nuxt works like. I'm pretty sure a lot of you already know this, but Nuxt is a server-side rendered version of Vue. So basically we make a request to the server. We have access to request, response, store if we use specific methods. And then we can pre-render the data, or we can use a static build as well. But this video is going to focus on pre-rendering the data on the server and then sending it to the client. So the data property is a synchronous data property. What that means is we can set the data property and it'll render on the server and the client, but it's limited to static data, and that is kind of the holdback of data. Usually what we want is maybe to make a request to an API and then populate data with that and then send back the file to the client. And to do that, we use asyncData. So asyncData is similar to data. It has a server-side version and a client-side version. But if we set it on the client side, if we set it on the server side, then we can do stuff like asynchronous requests and then populate the data before the document gets sent back, which we can't do in data. So with fetch, which is not the web API but the fetch method within Nuxt, it's kind of the same, except we don't set the data on the server with the asynchronous method. We set the data, or we do set the data, but not on the page or the component or the layout. We set the data within the store. So this does not give us access to the data that is in the client itself, on the page itself. Not the client, but the page or component or layout. So with async data, we set this data on the server, and when it comes to the client, we can access it with this.data. With fetch, we set it on the server, but we have to access it through the store if we set it on the store or whatever. So it's basically just meant to run something before rendering your page. It doesn't have to be a store thing, but just to make sure that you do something before the page gets sent back. nuxtServerInit works a lot like fetch, except its purpose is to be a store action. So this is an action that calls itself when the server initializes, and then we make a request to the server. The action runs, and it could be asynchronous and do a mutation, set the state, and then when that's done, we can send back the pre-rendered stuff with the store data, and we have access to that data in the store as well. So it also doesn't include data on the page or component. It has to do with the store itself. So enough talking, let's look at some demos. So what I've done is I just created a small little Vue application. The folder structure is, or Nuxt application, excuse me. The folder structure is the base structure that comes with Nuxt, with the store, and the pages, the components, the layouts, all the normal stuff. If you want to see how to set this up, go check out one of my other Nuxt tutorials. I always start from scratch, but today I just decided to do all the template and script and stuff just so we can work with the data. So let me just explain what's going on here. The index page, so the home page, has a list container that has a list item component. And this list item is looping, and it's getting a title prop. And the title we're setting from the titles in the data property, the normal data, not async data. So if we go to components, we can see that we receive this prop, and the default fallback is just fallback. We set it, the default string is fallback. So if we open up a browser on localhost 3000, then we should see that the application renders our list. So we have title 1, title 2, title 3. And if you noticed, sorry, I'm just rearranging this stuff. If you notice, I have set a console.log in created. So if we look at the server, the logs within your command line tool will be on the server. So it does log the data. We have our title 1, title 2, title 3. If we look at the client, we'll see that we have an array of 1, 2, 3. So nuxtSSR logs is also the logs that happen on the server. It just gets sent through to the client. So we have access to this data. But let's say we want to make a request to an API and set this data. How would we do that? We can't do asynchronous stuff within data. It has to be an object that has a property of titles, and then those titles will be an array. So what if we do a created and then set this.data to data? That is one way of making a request and then sending it to data, but there's an easier way to do that. We can simply do it once on the server, and then it will be available on both sides. So we can emulate that by just saying asyncData, and then this will be a function like that, and then we can return an object with these titles. Save that, and there we have our titles. So now we removed our created, but if we log, it'll still be the same. Console.log this.titles. But this isn't really the use case for asyncData, because we want to do asynchronous stuff. So let's do a JSON placeholder. There's an API that has like a fake REST thing. So I'm just going to use this endpoint that they have, and it's basically just fake posts, and I'm going to add it to our component. So I'm going to say let URL equals that thing, and then in asyncData we can say async, which makes this an async function now, and then we can do const response equals await, and because we're awaiting this, Nuxt will know that it shouldn't render, it shouldn't send back the response before this is done. So we'll say await the fetch of that URL, and this fetch is the fetch API, but this isn't a browse environment, and I'm not sure if fetch will work. So let's be safe and use Nuxt's Axios module. Did we install it? Yes, we do have Axios available. So you can just install it when you run nuxt npx create nuxtapp. So I'm going to say, but then it won't be response. Yeah, and we can say this dot $ axios dot get the URL, and then we can say const data equals response dot data, and then we can return, but the data comes as an array of posts. So what we want to do is just say const titles equals data.map, which is a built-in function in JavaScript, and then the callback has a post, and we only want the post title. So we can destructure this and just say the title property within post, and then what we want to return is just that string title, and that'll give us an array of string titles. So now what we can do is return an object with titles, set as titles. Save that and see what happens. Reload. Cannot read property axios of this. Oh, that's true, because this is not accessible on the server side. So we have to import axios. So we can do const axios equals require axios, and then we can just do axios.get. Save that, reload, and there we have them. we have all of our posts being set from the server, and we can check that. We can make sure that that is what's happening by checking this, and there we go. We have all of these arrays of posts. Let's check if there's any errors. No errors. And you can see the same log from the nuxtJS SSR logs. So that means that we can do asynchronous stuff on the server side before rendering the page, and we can even change this when it accesses the page. So let's do mounted, which will only run on the client side. We can console.log process.client, and then we can reload this, check this out, and true. So that means we're only on the client side now. So what we want to do is, when we're on the client side, we want to say this dot titles dot equals an empty array. So it reloads on the server, and then when it gets to the client, it will be, and we can, before we do that, we can check and create it if it has been created. So created, which will run on the server first. We can log our posts, so console.log this dot titles. So if we reload this page, we can see our posts log, and as soon as it gets mounted, you'll even see a little flash of all our posts. But as soon as it gets mounted, we have access to this dot titles, which is very cool. So we are working with the server side stuff and the client side stuff with one little property. Okay, so now let's have a look at fetch. What fetch will do is we'll use it to populate the store. So let's first create a store, and in Nux, to create a store, you have to export the store's different keys. So we can do const state, and this has to be a function, equals a function that returns an object, and we can do titles will be an empty array, and then we can do, and we have to export this for this to work. So we can do export, and then we can say const act, or first mutations, because we have to use mutations to set our state. We have to export this, and we can say set titles. I'm just going to remove this. Set titles will take a state and a payload, and what it will do is it will say state dot titles will equal the payload, basically mutating our state. So now let's look at the fetch API. We don't need the actions yet. We'll use that when we do nuxtServerInit. But first, let's look at the fetch thing. So now we still have asyncData as to do our titles, but instead of this, let's remove that. And up here, let's first import our store, our map action, map state helper. So we can do map state from Vuex, and this is just a way to shorten our syntax. So what this does is it just accesses this .store.state. Whatever you want to access in a shorthand way. So what we want to do is look at fetch. So now let's set async fetch, and this receives a context. So this context is actually available within all these asyncData, fetch, nuxtServerInit. They all receive a context item, and we can go look at that by going to nuxt context, and then in the context you'll see that we have access to our app, to the store, to the current route, to parameters, to query, and this is in both client and server side. On the server side, we have implicit access to request, response, and before nuxt render, and then on the client side we have from, which means where is this current route coming from, and the current nuxt state, which is a very special state that we can set, but that's also a topic for another video. So we want to use the store. So instead of saying context, we can just destructure the store from there, and then what we want to do is say store.commit set titles, and then we want to give it that array of titles. So let's give it 1, 2, and 3. Save that. And now to use that, we have to use our computed property, and then we want to say ... map state, and this takes an array of names, and we're just mapping the title. So what this is doing under the hood, it's just saying it's creating a function like called titles, and then it's saying return this .store.state.titles. So that's that's all that's doing. And then save that. And there we have our titles. And this is also being set on the server side. So let's do console.log process.server and then inspect this. Oh, we have an error. View 1, property method titles is not defined on instance but referenced during the render. Okay, so that was just an error. I don't know where that came from. So let's reload this page, and there we have true, because we are on the server when we do that. And we don't have, this nuxt log comes from the server. So this commit is happening on the server before we send back the page. So that means everything is ready to go, and we can do all sorts of asynchronous stuff. So what an asynchronous thing, because we do say async now, so what we want to do is again just do const response equals await axios.get the URL, and then const data equals the response.data, and then const titles equals data.map, and we want to get the title property, and then just return that title property. When we return that, it creates an array for us. So now what we want to do, instead of 1, 2, 3, we want to set it to that array of titles. Save, and there we have all our titles again. Rendered on the server, sent to the client. Compared to asyncData, that seems pretty much the same, but if we didn't have this computed thing and we save, then we wouldn't see our titles, because fetch does not set the, doesn't matter what we return. If we say return titles and we save that, it's not like the asyncData method that sets titles. You can see property method title is not defined, but if we return titles in the asyncData, then we will have it available. So that is the key difference between those two. We have to do something in fetch, and we still need to get our data from the store. Okay, so next up and finally, we can look at nuxtServerInit. A lot like fetch, except it happens in the store. So it's an action that runs by itself when the server initializes. Oops. And the action's name is nuxtServerInit, which also receives that context. But first, it receives the context of the store. So we want to give it the commit, because this will be that store context where you have store.commit or whatever. So we can give it the commit here, and then in this context we'll use request or response or whatever. So we'll just use commit, and then what we want to do is all the things that we did here. We can remove axios from here. And the reason why we would use nuxtServerInit instead of fetch is to basically have this run for the entire application and not a specific page. So if we use fetch, we can use something on that page, or which is specific to that page, to set the store or something like that. But nuxtServerInit runs in the store and makes it available to the entire application. So you would want to seed your application's initial data from this, maybe by doing this request. So we can do all of this and put it in here. Because if we, for example, want this data to be available, this titles data, in all our components, that means every single component when it's fetched, every single page when it's fetched needs to run this async fetch method. And instead of doing it over and over, we can just do it once. So let's save that. We can get our URL because we need that as well. And we can get our map state we need this, we need that, save that. And now we can look at our actions, which needs to be async. And then we can commit set titles. And there we have it. So this nuxtServerInit is doing the same thing as fetch. It's setting the store, but from the global store. So it doesn't matter what page we do map state on, we'll have access to the titles, because as soon as the application is generated or started, the store action runs. Whereas if it was just in the index or in the list items component or whatever, so you might want to break down your API request into smaller data chunks. So you'll just do a fetch from this component that fetches maybe one item based on the request. So we could do, just to try something quickly, we can do async fetch, and then instead of or we can do async data rather, because we only want to access it in this page, async data, and then we have in the context we have that store and we have that params. So something we could do here is we could say if store.state.user, because remember we don't have access to this, so we have to use the store like that. So if store.state.user return some object, return maybe logged in as false, and then we can do if no store.state.data. Yeah, we can actually just do return logged in as true. So that is that is some pattern that we could use. So we check with async data, and we can use this route params as well. So if we make a request for a specific ID or something, we can say if params.id equals page.id or something like that, some data property that you said, then you can dynamically render some sort of data on the server before sending it back. Like in the case of this, if there is a user, we don't have to say like in the menu bar log in, because he's already logged in. If there's no user in the menu bar, we can say don't log in, you know, and this is rendered on the server side instead of having to. So we can do a fetch. We can do a fetch to our API server and say fetch user, and then if user, all those kinds of things, because we have async data available to us. And we don't need to do that in any other component except if this was like the auth component, we wouldn't need to do that in the store. So that's why there's different contexts in which you use all these different ways of getting this data and setting it here. So it's a very simple example, but I hope I got the differences through. So just to recap, on the page we could either have, we can have one of three things. We can have data, we can have async data, and we can have fetch. So data is synchronous, and it is available on both client and server, but you can't fetch something from another API or something like that. It has to be synchronous, it has to be static data. Async data can use fetch, etc. And then fetch doesn't make data available, just lets you run code before client, something like that. So that's the difference between those three. And then in index, the nuxtServerInit would be just like fetch, except in store, and it runs by itself. So you don't have to call this function or anything like that. It just runs on the server. So I hope this helped someone out or made some sense to you guys. It's a short one today. I am planning on making a course a free course on YouTube because I'm graduating soon and I'll have a bit of extra time. But I want to make a free course on web development in general and release videos weekly or bi-weekly for complete beginners. I know my videos have been targeting a little bit more intermediate type folks, or a bit better than beginner, because you know it's based on frameworks and stuff. But what do you think about creating a beginner course for free from scratch, from zero knowledge to being able to create a website and put it on a server and understand what's going on? Yeah, let me know in the comment section what you think. If you like the video, please give us a like, and thank you for watching. Channel is growing slowly but surely, and I really appreciate it, guys. I'll see you in the next video. Peace.